Hey folks, we are here to talk about a practice question this week. And the one that we are talking about today, if you haven't figured this out already, is require.js related, which is used all over Magento. And what we're looking at today is some of the key functions that are used in require.js. And it's important that we have an understanding of the way that they work. So with that, let's jump into the question and take a look at what we're talking about in this question. The question is, what is true regarding the differences between the define and require functions? And two of these answers are correct. Answer A, define is passive and only runs when it is called. B, require is always run as long as the module's file is loaded. C, require is a dependency of the application and an error will result if this module is missing. And finally, D, define is an application's entry point. This is what should be used in a PHTML template. Let's step through those one at a time and dissect them. Answer number A, define is passive and only runs when it is called. This is true. Define is something that I think of in terms of defining a module. We're going to tell the computer about something that we have. So this would be a correct answer. B, require is always run as long as the module's file is loaded. Basically meaning as long as this require function is there, it's going to be executed. True. That is also correct. Require is always run and it's immediately executed. So right there we have our two answers that are correct, A and B. Now, moving on to C, just for the sake of discussion, let's talk about these other answers here. C, requires a dependency of the application and an error will result if this module is missing. This is not correct. However, there's that element of truth in there that can cause this to appear like it would be a good answer. The reason I say there's an element of truth in there is because if the first parameter in the function has a dependency that is missing, an error will result. So there is kind of sort of a situation where this would actually happen in some sense, but it wouldn't happen in the way that it's written. And that's the important thing to recognize, right? If we require a module that doesn't exist, or there's a typo in our definition or something like that, then it will error out and it will crash. And so we can call require and we can get a crash by putting in a invalid dependency in there. So C is incorrect. D, define is an application's entry point. This is what should be used in a PHTML template. This is a little bit easier to recognize as false or incorrect because of the mention of the PHTML template. We'll look at this in just a second, but it's pretty easy to use require in a PHTML template, and that is like the correct way to add JavaScript to a PHTML template if we're looking to execute something right there on the page in that sort of a way. So define as an application entry point kind of brings in some require.js types of concepts related to application entry point and things like that. For us as Magento developers, a lot of that has been abstracted out, so we don't think about the main entry point so much in require.js. Before jumping into the code and show you just a little bit of examples, one of the things that I always like to do is think about where we could get this information in the first place. And one of the great things about like online practice tests and things like practice test questions and things like that is we have the ability to look it up if we don't know the answer. That's real life. If we don't know the answer, we can look it up. And the require.js documentation is really good relating to some of these things. Magento has made some modifications, but it's not as heavy as like Knockout.js, for instance, or something like that. So requirejs.org is the place to go for these types of questions. So let me take a look at the code here and show you a little bit of what I'm talking about. So we have a require call right here in a PHTML template that's part of the core. This is the Luma theme, the layered navigation module, and effectively a modification to that module. And what we're doing here is depending on jQuery and adding some class to this. Now, if we didn't have the jQuery requirement, we wouldn't actually need to use the require function. We could just call it right here in the template. Now, this is a particularly interesting example to me because I have seen a number of different times where this is done incorrectly. This is done in a way that doesn't work, and it is poses a problem because there can be times when the jQuery library somehow exposes or shows the jQuery like variable on the window superglobal. And what you can end up with is a situation where some add-ons or the jQuery library additions are not actually available in places where they should be, or you get a race condition. So this is something to keep in mind right here, this aspect of jQuery and adding it to require, because sometimes this is all it takes to fix that problem. So I've seen it more than once, and it's one that's interesting to me because there can be more than one copy of jQuery, but some of them are not initialized correctly. So if you're using this in Magento, this is the right way to do that. Another instance where we see require being used is a little bit deeper in the core. We're doing some, Magento is doing some work with Knockout.js here, and we have a bunch of calls to require, which are getting those other modules and including them directly within the component to the file that we're looking at here. As far as the define side, this is something that we're pretty familiar with for anyone that's done much Magento JavaScript development, as it is very commonly used. This is definitely the one that's the most common. And there's the list of dependencies is an array, and it is the first parameter here, and then the function that will be executed at a later point is the second. And anywhere that you are defining a module and going to be calling it later, this is where you would use define, and this is where Magento uses it as well. So we see the same structure as require, but we have a little bit different use cases because they work differently. So here's another example, just a little custom example with extending a widget, jQuery widget, and we have our list of dependencies and then the actual extension right here. So couple things to remember. If you're in PHTML, probably the right one to use is require. If you're in a .js file, probably the right one to use is define. And again, I like to think of these as require sounds more immediate and sounds more demanding, if you will, whereas define is a little bit more laid back. And that's a way to think about the way that these functions are used. So next time you need to add some JavaScript to a page, keep these two things in mind for good success.